thanks very much for that introduction. I like the way you put the emphasis on the word many when you said many, many years. It feels like many, many years. Okay, so the mic's working okay? People can hear me at the back all right? Yep, great. Look, I want to say a few things by way of introduction, and I guess the first thing I really need to say is that I have never fought a fire. I haven't experienced a fire. And so I haven't got that kind of visceral experience of what it means to be in the context of a fire that's raging. I don't know what that experience is like. That means that I don't know what it's like to lose my home, to lose my possessions. I don't know what it's like to lose a loved one in a fire, and I don't know what it's like to experience my relationship start to crumble following the aftermath of a fire. So I need to be clear about that. I don't know what that's like. At the same time, of a man of a certain age, I've had my fair share of grief, and I can connect with that aspect of the experience very easily. And when I was preparing, I was starting to think about this presentation. It was a few weeks ago, and the fires were raging in New South Wales. And the brief that I had really was to do something theoretically about this, to really look at the relationship between men's experiences of fire and kind of broader theoretical discussions about masculinity and gender inequality and what the connections and the links might be. And as I was conscious of the men fighting the fires in New South Wales, I thought, gee, this is going to be a tough one. This is going to be a real tough one. And as I also listened to the stories this morning, listened to the experience of Sharon, who talked about the impact that it had on her partner and her relationship, and as I heard the quotes read out from the men, and as you spoke about your direct experience, and I thought, gee, how am I going to kind of really talk theory after so much grounded and lived experience? But that's what I'm going to try and do, because I do believe that theory is important. I do believe that some of these wider theoretical debates about masculinities and about gender inequality are actually fundamental for us moving forward. But I'm conscious that in speaking theory, that it may rub up against some of the lived experience, particularly because I actually want to say some things that may be a bit controversial, they may be a bit challenging, and I really want to encourage you, and I want to make sure there's plenty of space and time at the end of my talk to have comments and questions, and I really want to encourage you to kind of come back at me and challenge anything. If I've said something that's unsettled you or challenged you or confronted you, then please come back and give voice to your experience about that. The other thing I think I need to say is that I'm not an expert in disaster studies. This is not my field of research as an academic or as a scholar at all. But because I work around issues of men and masculinities, I often get invited into kind of areas that are way outside my comfort zone. I often get asked to talk about issues of masculinity in relation to some phenomena that's going on in society. Sometimes it's something that it's a field that I don't have a connection with. And when I was asked to do this, I thought, look, I don't know about disasters. This is not my area. Yeah, but, Deb said, oh, you know about masculinity? Let's talk about masculinity. Yeah, but I sort of feel, I really thought I needed to kind of ground myself, though, in the context. So over the weeks leading up to the conference, I really immersed myself in the scholarship and the literature around disaster studies generally, and more specifically the work that's been done on gender and disaster. Now, I'm actually not going to take the opportunity to show off what I've been reading over the last few weeks, because for two reasons. One, if I did start to open up with detail about the gender and disaster literature, I'd embarrass both Elaine and myself, because I would be continually referring to her work. She's written so much about this over the last 10, 15 years, and I've just been struck by the wealth of the contribution she's made. And also because I really didn't want to overlap too much with what I thought Elaine might talk about. So I want to start off by saying a few things about that general field, but then I want to kind of move in to talk more generally about masculinities, and then I want to come back. So I want to come back to the issue of what the masculinities literature, what light it might have to shed on the kinds of experiences that we've been talking about today. So 4 comments by kind of way of introduction about this. I guess the first thing is to note is that disaster studies have been relatively slow to really kind of look at gender. And it's really probably only been, last 15 years or so, maybe 15, or maybe not, about 15 years or so, that the gender has started to come into our understanding and analysis of disaster. So it's a fairly new and emerging field. Much of this early literature around gender and disasters really tended to focus on the differences between men's and women's experiences of disaster. And we've heard a little bit about that earlier this morning too, in terms of some of the stories that have been told. There's been quite a bit of focus on the difference in mortality rates between women and men, the different ways that men and women respond to and experience disasters. And with some of this literature, I think one has to be very, very careful not to kind of essentialise men and women, and also not to see men and women as two homogeneous groups that are fundamentally different. Because in some of the gender and disaster literature, as I looked at it through my kind of critical masculinity lens, it wasn't really a lot about the kind of social construction of gender. There wasn't really much theoretical underpinnings being explored about why men are the way we are and why women are the way they are. So some of that theoretical work hadn't been done. The other thing, and this is understandable I think, as you bring gender into a new field, you tend to foreground women's experiences. Yeah, and that's an understandable thing. And the danger is, and Elaine mentioned this earlier this morning, the danger with that is then that gender becomes equated with women. So when we talk about gender issues, that means we're talking about women's issues. It's like men don't have a gender, men are not gendered too. So, that's been, so that just as gender has been slow to come into disaster studies, so men and masculinities have even been slower. But, this is now starting to get on the map. The final thing I want to say by way of introduction is that most of the work around gender and disaster, as I kind of got into the literature, was really focused on the impact of the disaster on men and women. There was very, very little work done on the gendering of prevention. Very little work done on masculinities and prevention. And that's an issue that I actually want to come back to towards the end of my talk today. So what does a critical masculinity theorist like me have to contribute to the gendering of disasters? There are sort of a number of areas where my work has been located, and this is about how do we understand what masculinity is, how do we understand men's privilege, how do we understand rural masculinities, because many of the natural disasters occur in rural communities. How do we understand mateship? I think mateship is an important concept here. And how do we understand men's experiences of trauma? Now, this is my kind of field. I think I want to look at each of those 5 areas in terms of unpack them a little bit and then come back to what all this might mean then for how we gender men and disasters and how we understand men's involvement, particularly in disaster prevention. I want to start off, and this is where I'm really conscious of maybe being a bit controversial, because I want to kind of challenge some of the ways in which, what I've seen as the kind of common sense or default ways in which we think about masculinity or about gender. And it's what I call this a kind of essentialist view, where men and women are seen as having intrinsically different natures, fundamentally and intrinsically different. Masculinity is seen as something that's kind of hardwired into men, hardwired in, to do with testosterone levels and XY chromosomes in the body. And this even, all the research around differences between men's and women's brains. There was a book published about 5-6 years ago called Why Men Don't Iron. Okay, why men don't iron. Why don't men do ironing? Why don't men do housework? And the argument in this book was, well, it's because really men and women have very different brains, And men's brains require a much greater degree of intellectual challenge to get the brain cells working. And housework is sort of boring and mundane, and it's not challenging enough for men to get inspired and engaged, whereas women don't mind it so much because of the differences in the brains, right? Now, if that was true, then there's a kind of natural division of labour between women and men. If that was true, trying to change the division of labour between women and men would be going against nature, trying to turn, asking something that men they'll be totally incapable of doing. So, so this kind of essentialist idea is very powerful. There was also a book published a few years ago called The Inevitability of Patriarchy. The Inevitability of Patriarchy. And patriarchy, men's dominance, men's power and control over women, was seen to be purely a result of male nature. Men were seen to have what the writer referred to as an aggression advantage. An aggression advantage. And this aggression advantage, this biological basis of men's aggression, was seen as an explanation for why we have a patriarchal society and why men are in dominant positions of power and control throughout the echelons of society. Now, I want to challenge this view. And the reason why I feel a bit nervous in challenging it in this audience is because what the research shows is that the majority of firefighters and the majority of people in emergency services believe that's to be true. The research tends to show that firefighters on the whole believe that masculinity is hardwired. Men in emergency services tend to believe that masculinity is hardwired. And so if you believe it's hardwired, if you believe it's some sort of essential nature of men to be the way they are, then talk about the social construction, the transformation of masculinity in men would be to go against nature. So, okay. I really expect some comeback at the question time about that, because if what the research says is true, a significant number of men, at least in this room, believe that to be so. And what I'm going to say is going to be challenging that. There's a second kind of approach here as well in relation to masculinity that seems to offer more potential for change. And it's what's called the sex role kind of approach. And in this approach, men and women are seen as kind of socialised into two different roles. There's the male role and there's the female role. And masculinity, in this view, is at least seen as something that's learnt. And if it can be learnt, then it can be unlearnt. If masculinity is something that you internalise through, through socialisation, then maybe we can socialise men into becoming different from how they are. So it seems to promise some opportunity for change. And we often do see this notion of sex roles, gender roles. We hear a lot of talk about, well, we need more role models for men. We need alternative role models for men. If we have alternative role models, men will find a different kind of masculinity, a different way of being a man they can aspire to. The problem with this kind of idea is that it tends to presume that we live in a gender-equal world and that these male and female roles just kind of sit alongside each other on some kind of gender-equal plane. And what it doesn't kind of grasp, it doesn't grasp the inequalities in the nature of our society and the active processes by which men oppress women. Women are not just oppressed by gender role stereotypes. Women are oppressed by men. Men engaged in particular practices. And men are not oppressed by role stereotypes. I mean, some men are oppressed in this society because of class, because of race, of sexuality, of disability. But men, I would argue, are not oppressed as men by kind of expectations of what it is to be a man. They may be hurt by it, they may be stunted and limited by it, but they sure aren't oppressed by it in the way that women are oppressed by it. The other problem with this sex role kind of theory is that it has this kind of normative kind of notion, although there's one masculinity, one form of masculinity. And usually, although it's unstated, this masculinity is a white, heterosexual, middle to upper class masculinity. this kind of notion of the sex role, it doesn't really acknowledge that there's incredible diversity and difference in men's lives. Incredible diversity and difference. There's not one masculinity. And so it doesn't quite get at the kind of issues. So in response to this, over the last probably 15 years or so as well, I guess, just as disaster studies have discovered gender, we've really seen the emergence of a new kind of scholarship about masculinity. A kind of what some of us refer to as kind of critical masculinity studies, which is kind of challenging some of the ways in which we've thought about masculinity and gender. And there are just 4 things I'll say about this by way of introduction. One is this idea of there being multiple masculinities. So we really have to understand this diversity and difference in men's lives if we want to understand men. And furthermore, that in this diversity and this difference between men, there are relations of hierarchy. Just as there are relations of hierarchy between men and women, there are relations of hierarchy between men, which are to do with class and sexuality and race and ethnicity and geopolitical region of the world and able-bodiedness as well. There are these relations of hierarchy we need to understand. The other thing is we need to realise too that masculinity is not just an attribute of individual human beings, of men or sometimes women. Women can have masculinity too. But it's not just an attribute. It's something that's also institutionalised as well as being socially constructed. It's not just embodied by individual men. It gets institutionalised into organisations and the state and government and society. And that's one of the reasons why shifting it is so hard. It's not just about individual men learning to be gentler and different and more egalitarian and more respectful of women in their personal lives. It's not just about changing individual men. It means we've got to change structures in society if we're going to have a more gender equal world. And that's important to remember about gender. Gender is not just an attribute of individual men. It's systemically structured in our society. The other thing that's important about what this critical masculinity literature has to say is that masculinity is something that we do as men. Gender is done, it's enacted. We endeavour to kind of live up to a certain kind of notion of what it is to be a man. So we do gender as a practice. It's not just a noun, it's a verb. And we can either do it in ways that reproduce gender inequality as men, or we can do it in ways that challenge it. And that's where there's scope for agency. That's where there's scope for optimism and change, because we can do masculinity differently. We can do gender differently. Now, I want to talk about the work of Raewyn Connell, who's a very major Australian masculinity theorist, and because her work has really, I think, kind of been very significant in the ways we think about masculinity. And Connell talks about 4 different kinds of masculinity. And you've heard there was reference in Deb and Claire's report to the kind of hegemonic masculinities. And this is sort of an important kind of notion, I think, for how we understand these issues. Hegemonic masculinity is what's culturally dominant. It's idealised, it's promoted as a desirable attainment for young men to strive towards. It's usually heterosexual, it's aggressive, it's authoritative, it's courageous. And men and boys are judged in terms of whether they're able to live up to that hegemonic masculinity or not. Although it's culturally idealised, the vast majority of men don't live up to it, but men judge themselves against it. They judge themselves against that standard. Sport, work and power over women are some of the signifiers of this. And it's very much associated with the capacity for violence. Some would even say that hegemonic masculinity is a breeding ground for men's violence against women. And so that's an aspect of masculinity we need to understand. Connell also talks about what she refers to as subordinate and marginalised masculinity. And as I was saying earlier, excuse me, the diversity of masculinities are marked by hierarchy and exclusion. Now what this means is that men don't all benefit equally from what Raewyn Connell referred to as the patriarchal dividend. What Connell meant by that was that there are real benefits for men in patriarchy. One of the reasons why we don't have a men's liberation movement to bring about abolishing patriarchy is because, well, the vast majority of men get certain benefits out of it. Maybe they've got some things to gain too, and I'll talk a bit about that later on, but they sure as hell get benefits out of keeping it the way it is. But those benefits are unequally distributed. Some men get more benefits than others. Middle to upper class, white, straight men in the first world, Western societies get vastly more benefits. It's hard to think about the kind of benefits that Indigenous men get out of patriarchy, or refugee men, and gay men don't get the same benefits either. So there's an unequal distribution of the benefits. And these kind of notions of marginalised subordinate masculinities is very useful in understanding the way that masculinity intersects with issues of class and race and ethnicity and sexuality and ability. So men will do masculinity differently depending on where men are located in that stratification. The final kind of masculinity that Connell talks about, and I think it's perhaps one of the less theorised forms, is what she refers to as complicit masculinities. Although the majority of men don't meet the kind of normative standards and they don't enact this hegemonic masculinity, they nevertheless benefit from it in various ways. And this is where men who are not sort of aggressive and violent and highly chauvinistic, nevertheless are complicit with the society that gives them benefits and privileges. So these are men who would really stand up and say, look, I've never ever physically hit my partner, I'm not physically violent towards women. But they wouldn't challenge their best mate either if they knew that he was being violent. And that's what the research shows. The research is showing that the vast majority of non-violent men who would never be physically violent to a woman, if they knew that their best mate was being physically violent to his partner, they wouldn't challenge him about it. So they're complicit with it. They're what I call the kind of the perpetuators of gender inequality. They perpetuate gender inequality by not challenging it, by not contesting it, and not standing up against it. And I think we need to unpack this notion a lot more than we do. We also need to understand men's privilege in relation to this. And Alison Bailey has a definition of privilege where she says it's systematically conferred advantages that individuals enjoy by virtue of their membership of dominant groups. What that means is then, the privileges you get as a man are not privileges you've actually worked for, not privileges you've struggled to attain. They're privileges that just come to you by virtue of being born male in a patriarchal society. There are similar privileges about being born white as well. If you've got white skin in this society, you don't have to be racist or racially prejudiced to reproduce racial hierarchy in this country. You just go about your way, living your life as a white person in this country, and you end up reproducing racial hierarchy. Well, that's the way it is for men's privilege as well. And one of the ways that privilege works is that the majority of people who've got privilege, they don't recognise they've got it. They don't see themselves as having privilege. There was a book published some years back, a man called Warren Farrell, we call it The Myth of Male Privilege. He interviewed all these men, and these white, straight, upper middle class men said they didn't feel very powerful. Oh, Warren Farrell concluded, so white upper middle class men don't feel very powerful. Ipso facto, he concluded, they're not powerful. Male privilege must be a myth because they don't feel powerful. And this is the way privilege works. You know, those that have it often don't see themselves as having it. Men are slowly starting to recognise that women are disadvantaged, marginalised, even oppressed in this country. But it's another step to recognise that means men are privileged. If women are oppressed, men are privileged. Privilege is the other side of oppression. And those that are part of the privileged group really need to come to terms with what that means. What it means to be privileged, what it means to have privilege, what it means to kind of then have a cognizance of it and engage with it. And one of the ways privilege works for men is that privilege leads men to believe that as men, we're entitled to make claims on women. Now, we may differ as men about what claims we think we can make and whether or not we're going to use violence to enforce those claims or not, but we believe we're entitled as men. Now, men might resist this, challenge it, have a consciousness of it, but to grow up in a patriarchal society, to grow up male in a patriarchal society like ours, it's very, very rare for a man to be unscathed by that, untouched by it. Virtually all men are socialised into some degree of male supremacy. We may develop be cognizant of it, become aware of it, want to challenge it, want to relinquish it, want to deal with it in some way, but we sure as hell are not going to escape unscathed from it. And I think that's something that men have difficulty recognising, but I think we have to recognise it. The other thing that's important to say is that the majority of natural disasters, at least, are more likely than not to occur in rural settings, in rural contexts. And I think it's really important that we understand the rural framing within which these disasters are occurring. And a number of writers have pointed out that rural areas are more likely than urban areas to have much greater social and political conservatism. There's more likely to be a stronger enforcement in rural communities of very traditional gender roles, where women do all the domestic work and servicing and housework. There's more likely to be a strong belief in the privacy of the family, a distrust of people from outside the community, greater levels of surveillance by women, and strong social control forms. Now, back in 1992, and this is a fairly dated study now, although I think it's worth mentioning, even though this study was done over 20 years ago, and it hasn't been replicated to the same degree. This study by Dempsey is very important, and I'll talk a bit about why in a moment. But what Dempsey did was he looked at a rural community in Victoria, a community he named a small town. And he discovered that there was very much, patriarchy was alive and well in this rural community. And it was manifested in a whole variety of ways. Men controlled all the local decision-making bodies. They were on the council, all the kind of key boards in the local community were all dominated by men. There was a segregation of men's service clubs, there were men's only clubs, men controlled the churches. There was a dominance of male sport in terms of cricket and football in particular. There was the pub played a key role in gender segregation. There was a very rigid domestic division of labour between women and men. Women were subordinated in paid employment, and men and women tended to hold very traditional gender attitudes. Now, back in 92, Dempsey didn't really think there was going to be much, he didn't see any evidence of anything within that community that would bring about any shifts or changes. He really sort of felt that, look, this just seems so set in concrete. This seems so reproduced through generations and generations, and he didn't see any evidence that there was ever going to be any change. However, 20 years later, there has been a change. And it's not a change that's come from within. It's not a change that's generated from within that community. It's a change that's been generated from outside the community. Because there's been massive restructuring going on in rural communities, what we call a rural crisis. And that's manifested in a whole range of ways. We've got high levels of unemployment, particularly high levels of youth unemployment. There's been a corporate downsizing, real wages of men have been declining, massive changes in technology in terms of farming communities, declining in manufacturing jobs. Farms have been sold, women have had to move more into the general farm maintenance, and that's shifted the division of labour in farms. So there's been a rural crisis, and this restructuring going on in rural communities has invariably had an impact on men. And these are some of the consequences that rural researchers are starting to identify. There's melancholia, nostalgia and loss, and to the point where some researchers talk about men evidencing a melancholic masculinity, that men are feeling so affected and devastated by the changes that they felt disempowered, and that the wounds that men carry as a result of those changes are very powerful. Men who define themselves through paid work, measuring their masculinity by the size of the paycheck, are not getting that work. And so we see high levels of grief in relation to men. Men feel grief in relation to their relationships with their partners, with their siblings, and with their children. There's increasing rates of suicide, increasing rates of alcoholism. Men are being restricted to low-paid and casual work, and hence there's a declining self-esteem. And this emphasis on stoicism and rugged individualism, which has been part of the kind of rural masculinity, has made it very difficult for men to respond to these changes. Some men have responded and shifted their masculinity in response to what's going on, but the men who are the most traditional, the men who have held to that very traditional masculinity, have probably suffered the most as a result of these things that are going on in men's lives. The other thing I think that's important to talk about, particularly in the context of rural community, and it has an issue, I think it's relevant to the issue of bushfires as well, is the kind of notion of mateship. And mateship among men, you know, it's a particular form of homosocial bonding, and all patriarchal societies have different forms of homosocial bonding among men. But there's something peculiarly Australian about mateship. It's a particular form of homosocial bonding. This is the idea that, well, a mate will always stick with you. And loyalty to one's mate is really more powerful and more important than observance of the law. So you really stick by your mate, even if he's committed a crime. That loyalty to the mate is very, very important. It's become part of the national identity, even to the point where some years ago when John Howard was in power, he talked about including it as a preamble to the Australian Constitution. Of course, it goes back to the Anzac period, and it's celebrated in sport and communal drinking. But there's another side of mateship, and it's a side of mateship that we don't talk very much about. It's what I see as the dark side of mateship, because the interpersonal satisfactions that men get out of mateship are often at the expense and of the dissatisfaction of women in their lives. So the benefits and the camaraderie that men gain from mateship are often experienced by women as something negative. Of course, it disdained what is perceived as weak emotion. So it's very much to do with this hegemonic masculinity. Mates are almost always heterosexual. So gay men are marginalised. Mateship reproduces homophobia and heterosexual dominance. And of course, it's also constructed against the image of Indigenous men, of refugee men, of non-white men. So mates are usually always white. So it doesn't break those kind of racial barriers. And in Australia, it's specifically linked, excuse me, to group rape and sexual assault. There are other Western countries that have higher rates of sexual violence against women than Australia, but Australia actually has the highest rate of group and rape than any other Western country in the world. And it's been connected to mateship. Pack rape and group sexual assault are definitely connected to Australian forms of mateship. And that's the dark side we don't like to talk about. The other relevant area of masculinity work that's been done that I think can potentially shed some light on this issue is men's experience of trauma. When I was reading the draft report that Claire and Deb produced, and I read many of the quotes that some of which Deb and Claire spoke about earlier this morning, it really struck some parallels with me with some interviews that I did a couple of years ago with peacekeepers from Afghanistan and Iraq. I'm looking to you. I don't have 5-minute warning yet, do I? Good. Okay. I was looking for some sort of sign or something. I did some interviews with Australian peacekeepers who'd been deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq and come back about their experience of deployment. and about the way in which they were experiencing coming back into Australian community after being deployed. And I saw dramatic similarities in the experiences the men reported following the bushfire and the experiences these men reported from their deployment experiences. And I remember some years ago, it was about 5-6 years ago, I should have known this a lot earlier, but I stumbled across a reference to the fact that there were more Vietnam veterans who took their lives after the Vietnam War than were killed during the war. In fact, 3 times as many. 3 times as many veterans of the Vietnam War took their own lives after the war than were actually killed during the war. And we have memorials about all the men who died in the war. We don't have memorials about the men who suffered and took their own lives after the war. In 2010, this is also a stat that I stumbled across very, very recently, there were more soldiers took their own lives than were killed in all the war zones across the world. More soldiers took their own lives in 2010 than were killed in battle zones around the world. And so, as I reflected on those kind of the similarities as I read the accounts by these men, I thought, you know, we really need to understand the nature of trauma, and we need to really get more insight into the connections between trauma and masculinity. Because at one level, trauma is about a loss of sense of self. What we don't know a lot about, though, the way that men's experience of masculinity contributes to their experience with trauma. Because to lose a sense of self is to seem to fail as a man. And one of the ways in which, and there's a kind of double-edged sword to this, that following on from the Vietnam War, the veterans lobbied to get some recognition and acknowledgement of their trauma, and they fought to have the notion of post-traumatic stress disorder incorporated into the DSM-4 as it was at that time, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And on the one hand, what that did was it gave them some legitimacy to talk about the traumatic experiences of the war, but it medicalised them at the same time. It medicalised that experience. And so while it offered an avenue for psychological help and access to benefits, it also left them feeling they failed as men. Because one of the experiences of trauma is seen as something that's feminine. To acknowledge you're traumatised is somehow or other to confront and challenge your masculinity. And I think we need to, if we're going to be able to respond appropriately to these men's experiences, and I know there are men in this room who were interviewed for this study who've had that experience, I think we need to understand the relationship between that trauma and masculinity. And I would even go so far as to say that trying to live up to a particular notion of masculinity is itself a form of trauma. But it can be traumatic to try to live up to a particular set of expectations about masculinity. Okay, so what does all this mean then? Or this notions of masculinities, rural communities, trauma, how might that help us understand the gendered context of masculinity? The first thing to say about this is that, and a number of commentators have made this point, that emergency management organisations are run almost on militaristic lines. They're modelled on the military. They're very patriarchal, very hierarchical organisations, very male-dominated organisations. And if we're going to be able to look at the kind of the gender, this whole disaster area, we really need to be challenging the way in which emergency services represent patriarchal forms of organisation. And that has implications, I think, for a number of other areas about connection between masculinity and firefighting, risk, reconstruction, fire prevention and equality. And I want to look at each of these in turn. As was reported as Deb and Claire talked about the experiences of these men, there was this theme that came through again and again and again as the men talked about sort of this notion of living up to a particular kind of masculinity and perhaps not meeting it. Because we had this iconic image of the firefighter as this courageous, this brave rescuer who puts their own kind of concerns about danger aside, the kind of this heroism, this heroic, iconic notion. And so to raise even questions about firefighters is to kind of, really kind of go against this sort of powerful, iconic image. I mean, people have only good things to say about firefighters, only good things to say. But what does it mean for the men who are firefighters themselves? What does it mean for them if they don't kind of live up to this notion that's always expected of them? It's certainly connected to this idea of hegemonic masculinity. And there certainly seems to be men talk about they prove their masculinity by taking risks, albeit sometimes calculated risks. But there's an emotional burden there as well. That heroism carries with it an emotional burden. And we need to recognise that. And this is connected to risk. We've heard reference already to the gender differences in risk and the differences between men and women about whether or not they stay and fight the fire or whether they evacuate. And we know from all the research that's done that men are more likely to want to stay and fight and women are more likely to want to evacuate. We also know that difference between men and women is a source of disagreement and argument. And as the fire is approaching and the man and the woman are disagreeing whether they're going to flee or fight the fire, and we hear stories about whole families that perished because they were stuck in an impasse about that. They couldn't break through that disagreement. But we need to ask ourselves whether or not this difference in perceptions of risk between women and men, is it a gendered, socialised difference, or is it a reality that women are more at risk than men? Do women accurately perceive the risk? When women perceive the risk as being greater, are they actually accurately perceiving it, that for them and then for the children, that the risk is greater? We also know about this risk-taking as a form of masculinity. Men prove their masculinity by this risk-taking. So we need to really kind of raise some questions about what it means to take risks. Why is it that men have to continually prove their masculinity? What does that mean? Could we have another look at that and ask some questions about why that has to be so? I'll just skip over this because we've heard about this from the previous presentations this morning. We know that masculinity is involved in the process of reconstruction. And we know it impacts on men in terms of forms of exaggerated and hyper-masculinity. We know that there's an escalation in men's violence against women. We know that there's escalation in men's alcohol consumption. So we know that there are these sorts of differences. So I won't kind of replay that. Well, what I think is interesting, and this is the area that I think we really need to do some more work on, because I think it's the area that I don't see articulated currently in the gender and disaster literature, and it's the issue of fire prevention. And there's some very troubling research that's coming out, which is that it seems as though firefighters on the whole, and I'd be interested to get some comment about this, but that firefighters on the whole don't seem to be very interested in fire prevention. Now, why is that? I mean, if firefighters are concerned about saving lives, why would they not be concerned about the prevention of fires, which is going to save lives? Is it, as Bajan argues, and Bajan's a kind of really interesting character. He was a firefighter for over 25 years before becoming a researcher, and he did a PhD interviewing firefighters. And he argues that, well, look, firefighters are only really interested in saving lives at what he called the sharp end. They're only really interested in saving lives when they can embody that iconic courageous, brave, rescuing kind of masculinity, where the firefighter runs into the burning building and brings out, the woman and the children. That's a kind of life-saving, risk-taking form that the firefighter is interested in. But preventing fires, stopping fires from happening, looking at, if the increase in fire, I know there's a debate about this, but if there is a relationship between increasing natural disasters and climate change, shouldn't firefighting organisations be involved in addressing climate change? Shouldn't that be a gendered issue? Shouldn't climate change be a gendered issue? Should we not be asking those sorts of questions? Should we not be looking at how do we prevent natural disasters from occurring in the first place? And how does gender play into that? Now, I think this is the area that needs more work. But are firefighters interested in doing themselves out of a job? Or are there so many benefits with this iconic rescuing masculinity that really kind of keeps it alive? 5? Sorry, 2 minutes. Okay. Look, I do want to say something about. Actually, I was going to talk about Shirley Petula's work, but I won't go over that because you spoke about it earlier today. You should read the book. It's in the Fire. I think it's In the Fire. It's a wonderful book, and she really looks at the way in which disasters impact on gender relations. So I want to skip ahead. I want to just look just 2 slides, and then I'll stop. Well, why? Because she did come. Petula came to a kind of she looked at some possible changes, but she really, in the end, was pessimistic about the potential for men to shift and change. And so I did want to kind of finish up with the question, but why would men challenge gender inequality? What's in it for men? And Connell articulated 4 reasons. The first is personal well-being. That while men may not be oppressed by patriarchy, there are negative effects on men. Men do die 6 to 7 years earlier than women do. That's what the current stats show. We know that men who embody hegemonic masculinity, men who are violent and aggressive, have a greater likelihood of having heart attacks than women do. So you can try to sell gender equality to men on the basis, look, you'll live longer. Okay, that's one way. You might want to challenge patriarchy because you'll get to live longer. That's not a bad reason. There are relational interests that men have with women too, that all men have mothers, many men have partners and daughters, and if you love your daughter, if you love your mother, if you love your partner, if you respect your female colleagues, and this is an issue that impacts on them, and you want to be an ethical father, brother, son, partner, then you've got to get involved in this issue because it's impacting on the women in your life, and that's going to impact on you. There are the collective interests. There's that whole question about maybe the sustainability of the planet's at stake here, that seems to be a connection between masculinity and destruction of the environment. But there's also the issue of principle, and irrespective of whether men get anything out of it or not, irrespective of whether there's what's in it for men, and someone, of course you want to kind of get men engaged and involved, so you've got to promise there's something in it for men too. Gender equality is good for men as well. But look, by the end of the day, whether it's anything in it for men or not, men should address it anyway for human rights and social justice reasons. And there is a bit of a debate about how much we focus on why men should change. And there are dangers in focusing on what men get out of it, because then maybe we'll lose sight of the principles of social justice and human rights. The final slide is there's also a debate about whether the issue here is constructing a new form of masculinity. Can we develop a kind of democratic, healthy masculinity? Is there a kind of positive way of being a real man? And I'm conscious of some of the anti-violence campaigns that were done a few years ago. It was real men don't bash. Real men are not violent. Interesting, kind of appeal to masculinity, but if real men and men living up to what it means to be a real man is part of the problem, then real men don't bash is a problematical slogan. There's an anti-violence campaign targeted at young men called Be the Hero. be the hero, you know, so using the hero iconic image to attract men into alternative masculinity. Now, some would say that's the way to go. We construct a democratic, egalitarian, healthy masculinity. John Stoltenberg, he provocatively says, look, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about a healthy cancer. He says masculinity is so fundamentally flawed that we need to construct a sense of moral selfhood as men, and that means we need to loosen our connections to masculinity, loosen the importance that masculinity has in our lives. To be ethical human beings, we need to break with masculinity. Now, that's confronting and challenging for many, many men, particularly if you believe it's hardwired in. But this is the kind of conversation I believe as men we've got to have if we're going to sort of move forward. I'll stop there. Thanks.